You know, sometimes in history, you get these stories that are so incredible they almost sound made up. We're talking about a real-life David versus Goliath story set in the brutal cold of the 1939 Winter War. A tiny, outgunned force did something that should have been impossible. This is the story of the Battle of Suomussalmi. So, that's the big question, right? How on earth does that happen? How does a handful of Finnish soldiers not just stop, but completely wipe out a massive Soviet invasion force? Well, the answer is an absolute masterclass in strategy, sheer grit, and using your environment as your most powerful weapon. Okay, so let's look at the Soviet plan. It was brutally simple and incredibly ambitious. The idea was to drive straight through Finland's skinniest part, right to the city of Oulu. If they pulled it off, they would have literally cut the country clean in two. That would sever a vital supply line from Sweden and turn Finland's defense into an absolute nightmare. The stakes? They could not have been higher. Now, to pull this off, the Soviets didn't mess around. They brought a juggernaut. This was meant to be a swift, overwhelming knockout punch delivered by a huge, modern, mechanized army. And so, on November 30th, it begins. Division after division of the Soviet Ninth Army just poured across the border. They were absolutely confident that their massive advantage in numbers and equipment would just steamroll any Finnish resistance on the way to their goal, Oulu. But just how lopsided are we talking about here? Let's actually look at the numbers, because this is where the story really starts to feel impossible. Get this, the numbers are just staggering. You have 17,000 Finns, and on the other side, 48,000 Soviet soldiers. That's nearly 3-to-1, and that's just the troops. We're not even counting the Soviets' huge superiority in tanks, artillery, trucks, you name it. On paper, this isn't a battle, it's a walkover. But here's the thing. The Finns had a plan, and that plan had absolutely nothing to do with playing by the Soviets' rules. Nope. They were going to use their single greatest asset, their own backyard. The man in charge of this whole thing was a Finnish colonel named Hjalmar Siilasvuo, and he knew one fundamental truth. If they fought a conventional battle, head-on, they'd be annihilated. So his entire strategy came down to one simple, brilliant idea. We will not fight their war. We will make them fight our war. So what does our war look like? Well, it looks like deep snow, dense forests, and frozen lakes. Think about it. You've got these massive, clumsy Soviet columns totally trapped on the few roads that exist, while the Finnish soldiers, these ghosts on skis, can strike from anywhere and then just disappear back into the trees. And it's that incredible mobility that allowed the Finns to pull off a tactic that would become absolutely legendary in the history of warfare. It's called the Motti tactic. Okay, first things first, you have to cut the head off the snake. Or in this case, you cut off its supply line. The Soviets were completely dependent on one single, narrow path snaking through the wilderness, the Raute Road. Just look at this map. You can see how that road is the only way through. It was the Soviets' absolute lifeline. So Finnish ski troops swept in, hit the column hard, and just severed it. And like that, 2 entire massive Soviet divisions were cut off. No more supplies, no more reinforcements, and no retreat. With that lifeline cut, the Finns moved on to phase 2. They started attacking the long, trapped Soviet column all along its length, chopping it up into smaller, isolated, and much more manageable pockets. These little pockets were called Motti. And this map shows you the result. You can literally see how the Finns just systematically carved up the Soviet army. Each one of those circles represents a Motti, a pocket of surrounded Soviet troops who are now freezing, starving, and totally unable to support each other. They became these little islands of desperation in a huge sea of Finnish-controlled forest. So for weeks, the Finns just kept tightening the noose around these pockets, and the trapped Soviets inside just got weaker and colder and more demoralized, until, suddenly, the breaking point was reached. On December 27th, Siilasvuo launched his final assault. The conditions were just brutal. We're talking sub-zero temperatures, deep snow, the works. By this point, the encircled Soviet soldiers, their will to fight was just gone. They were at the absolute end of their rope. And then, everything just broke. An account from the battle describes it perfectly. Russian resistance suddenly collapsed. The men bolted from their positions. The rout developed into a slaughter. It wasn't a retreat. It was a complete and total disintegration of a military force. The aftermath was just staggering. The Finns, who were desperately short on equipment, suddenly captured an absolute treasure trove. I mean, we're talking 43 tanks, over 70 big artillery pieces, hundreds of trucks, thousands of rifles. It's amazing. They essentially armed their own forces with the enemy's abandoned weapons. But the human cost tells the most lopsided story of all. The Finns lost around 2,700 soldiers. Soviet losses were catastrophic, with estimates ranging from almost 13,000 all the way up to 29,000 casualties. It was a victory on an almost unbelievable scale. So, how did this happen, right? What were the key ingredients that allowed David to so decisively crush Goliath? Let's break it down. First, superior mobility, hands down. Finns on skis were masters of the forest. The road-bound Soviets were just sitting ducks. Second, their tactics were unorthodox and brilliant. For instance, they would specifically target the Soviet field kitchens. I mean, think about it. An army in freezing temperatures without hot food is an army whose morale is about to collapse. Third, the Finns were just better prepared for the fight. They had proper winter gear and their morale was sky high. They were defending their homes. And finally, intelligence. They were frequently intercepting Soviet communications, which, believe it or not, were often being sent over simple phone lines. So ultimately, Suomussalmi was way more than just a single battle. It was this massive morale boost for the entire nation. And critically, it stopped the Soviet strategic plan dead in its tracks. It prevented Finland from being cut in half. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? Suomussalmi is this powerful reminder that troop numbers and technology don't always decide a battle. Sometimes strategy, terrain, morale, and just plain cleverness can turn a hopeless situation into a legendary victory. It perfectly illustrates that huge difference between having power on paper and having real strength in the field.